Well, it's October again, so you know what that means. It means I finally get to talk about my favorite werewolf movie. No, my favorite Halloween movie ever. An American Werewolf in London. So An American Werewolf in London came out in 1981, was written and directed by John Landis, and is a horror/comedy werewolf movie. And I'm so excited to finally be talking about this on the channel because, like I said before, this is my favorite movie to pop on at Halloween time because it's just so good. It's one of those you can't go back movies where once you've seen this movie, once you've seen the werewolf transformation, the creature effects, the storytelling, just all of it is so good that you watch any other werewolf movie and you're going to compare it to this one. So let's waste no time getting into it. So this movie opens up in northern England in the country somewhere, middle of nowhere, and you've got these two college-age guys, David and Jack, played by David Naughton and Griffin Dunne respectively, and they're backpacking their way through Europe, but they're not having the best time in northern England because it's just moors and lambs and not a whole lot going on right now. So they come across this bar called the Slaughtered Lamb, and this is where you first get a feeling that this movie is more self-aware and comedic than you might originally expect from a movie titled American Werewolf in London. Because this is a world where werewolf movies exist. They're part of popular culture. And when they go into this bar, it's very awkward because you got these two Americans in this very secluded British bar, and you know, the patrons are all regulars, so they look at them like, who are these outsiders coming in? And they start breaking the ice a little bit. It's super awkward and uncomfortable, but also kind of hilarious. And this has a lot to do with Brian Glover's performance as the chess player. He tells this joke about Remember the Alamo and it gets everybody laughing, having a good time. But then when Jack mentions this pentagram on the wall, everything goes dead quiet and Glover gets real serious, like he was deeply offended. And this is where the references to other werewolf media comes up, especially Lon Chaney Jr.'s original Wolfman from 1941. And if you want to know my thoughts on the original Wolfman, I actually did a video about it, and you can check that out after this one. And while I don't think it holds up, especially compared to this movie and other werewolf movies that have come later, I still appreciate the groundwork that that movie laid and how much of werewolf lore that we kind of take for granted now was born in that movie. And really, this movie, An American Werewolf in London, wouldn't exist without the Wolfman, so I do have to respect it for that. But anyway, the boys don't really get a whole lot of answers from this pub, and it's made very clear that they're not welcome here. They don't really want them to stay, so they leave, but it's a full moon, very dangerous outside. We're not quite sure what the danger is yet, but it's called An American Werewolf in London. I think we can figure out what it might be. So they leave, but they are told to stick to the road, stay off the moors, and beware the moon. And as they walk and it starts to rain, they follow absolutely none of those rules because they kind of veer off when the rain comes, and then when the rain stops, they look, and they are very far from any road you could find. And this is where the horror side of this horror comedy really starts to show, because it's here where we get our very first werewolf attack. And it's shot so well here because the camera only focuses on our two leads. You don't really see much of the woods. You don't see what they're looking at. And it's not until the wolf actually goes for it and tears out Jack's throat when we finally see the thing. And even then, they don't really show it a lot. All you know is it's this demon wolf from hell, and it's just tearing apart Jack. You just see stuffing from his sweater going everywhere. There's blood, and David runs for it until he just can't ignore the screaming pain from his friend, and he turns back and he goes to save him. But by that point, the wolf has disappeared and he just sees the corpse of his dead friend. And before you really have time to mourn the loss of Jack, the wolf pounces on David, and now David's under attack. But before he can actually die, the wolf gets shot, and now we see that the wolf turned into a man upon his death. And if you're familiar at all with werewolf movies, you know exactly where this is going. David got scratched by a werewolf, so now he's cursed. But before we can really get into David's curse, he has to recuperate for 3 weeks in the hospital. And the first couple times I watched this movie, when he's recuperating in the hospital, I always thought of it as the boring section of the movie because we do spend quite a bit of time here and not a lot of werewolf action really happens. It's just a lot of exposition. The doctors kind of tell him what happened after he passed out from his wounds. And the official story from the police is that it was a mad lunatic that escaped and he was on a rampage and he attacked your friend and he's the one that cut you up and left the scars. But David is still convinced that no, it wasn't a man, it was a rabid dog or something. It was some animal that attacked him. And it's this confusion and possibly conspiracy and cover-up of this whole werewolf incident added to the survivor's guilt of him surviving where his best friend Jack had died. He didn't even get to go to the funeral or anything or properly mourn his death. He's just been stuck in this hospital forever. But watching it now, I wouldn't change a thing because it's very important at establishing the new status quo of David's life. And we get to see a bit of a romance bloom between David and his nurse Alex Price, played by Jenny Agutter. I probably not pronouncing that right. And while it is a little strange for a nurse to be so infatuated with one of her patients, it is kind of cute and they have good chemistry together. So it does ultimately work out. You do buy their relationship. And it's here where he's recuperating in the hospital where we get a lot of trippy nightmare sequences that I somehow always manage to forget about every time I pop this movie in because they just kind of come out of nowhere and you realize that, oh, David's kind of drifting in and out of consciousness. And when he dreams, he's dreaming about wolf-ish things. The first one you see is just him running naked in the woods, which, okay, not that frightening. But then the second one you see is him in a hospital bed with the nurse in the woods, and he opens his eyes and it's this jump scare and he's got the fangs and he actually looks more, at least to me, like a vampire than a werewolf. So I'm not quite sure where they were going with that one. But the last one is by far the strangest and most vivid of all of them, which is David and his family, sitting around the living room, having a good old time, like nothing ever changed. But then all of a sudden the doorbell rings and you've got these really weird but also kind of goofy looking Nazi werewolf monsters that just come in and just start machine gunning everybody and stabbing them and just causing all kinds of chaos and mayhem. And that is definitely a nightmare scenario, but it doesn't stop there because he wakes up and the nurse is there and then she goes to open the blinds and then there's another jump scare with one of the wolf Nazi people stabbing her and killing her, and then you realize that it was a dream within a dream. And as I watch this movie more and more frequently because I love it and I finally got it on Blu-ray, so now I can just watch it whenever I want. I've gotten better at remembering all these nightmare sequences, so I kind of know what to expect now, but that fake out with him waking up only to be a dream within a dream, that still gets me to this day, and I've seen this dozens of times. And I guess these Nazi werewolf creatures are good at place as any to start talking about the makeup effects in this movie because they were done by the legendary Rick Baker and they look incredible most of the time. These Nazi werewolf creatures, I don't think they work quite as well as a lot of the other effects. They do ultimately end up looking like these Halloween masks and they're not really articulated like all the other makeups are in this movie. So that's a little disappointing, but the sheer variety and creativity in these masks kind of makes up for it. And also you don't see these monsters a lot. They don't really linger on their faces too much. You only see them for maybe a few seconds at a time. Maybe you'll get a real quick close-up, but that's about it. So the masks aren't that distracting and they don't take you out of it so much. But if I'm being fair, they are probably the worst effects in the movie. And when you're talking about a movie like this that the Academy had to make up a new category for special effects makeup so that this movie could get special recognition for Rick Baker's attempts here, that's saying something. But then after all these nightmare sequences are done, David gets a visitor, and it's his dead friend Jack. And Jack looks amazing here. He looks so disgusting to the point where it's kind of hilarious because he just acts as though there's nothing on him, that he's not covered in blood, that he doesn't have his throat ripped out, that he doesn't have this little dangly piece of flesh just flapping about. And every time I watch it, even though Jack is giving a great performance and he's funny and his timing is perfect and he's appropriately disgusting, I just can't look away from that little dangly bit of flesh. It's so mesmerizing and realistic. That makeup job is so anatomically correct and it really looks like Jack got just mauled by an animal. But if you can manage to stop drooling over the makeup job, he actually gives some really important bits of exposition. He says that he's part of the undead because he was killed in an unnatural way, and his soul won't be released until the werewolf's bloodline is severed, meaning David has to kill himself because at the next full moon he's gonna wolf out and he'll start killing victims of his own, and Jack is just gonna be stuck in limbo for all eternity, really, until either David dies or the next werewolf dies that he might inadvertently create. And I'm so glad that this is where John Landis wanted to take this story, because from here on out, it's all about David struggling with survivor's guilt and suicide, because he's getting visions from Jack and later other people telling him to kill himself, to do it in all these kinds of really macabre ways, because that's what I find so intriguing about werewolf stories. And this movie is one of the few ones that really focuses on the suicidal nature of being a werewolf. Because I always found it fascinating in the original Wolfman how when Lon Chaney Jr. found out he was a werewolf and that he could be responsible for all these heinous acts, he ultimately wanted to kill himself. He was suicidal. And what do you do when you find out that you're not fully responsible for your own actions? And is taking your own life the moral thing or not? And this movie, while they don't explore it so much where it becomes this really moody drama and they really tackle the interpersonal relationships between David and Jack, it still doesn't shy away from it either, and it keeps a really good balance of both horror and comedy, which is what John Landis really wanted to go for. And when he's going more horror in some scenes, he'll bring out that suicidal ideation that David has. And when he wants to go more comedy, he'll bring in more self-referential jokes about the Wolfman, or have David just try to escape the zoo butt naked after he wolfs out the first time, which is actually a really hilarious sequence, because after he wolfs out and he does a bunch of killings, he wakes up in a zoo surrounded by wolves and he has to escape, but he's got no clothes on because when he was a wolf he didn't have clothes, so it makes sense he wouldn't have clothes here. But he has to find these different ways of escaping the zoo while at the same time keeping his modesty. And it starts with him hiding in a bush and he steals balloons from this little boy, and the boy goes up to someone, I assume it's his parent, but it might not be. We don't really know who this woman is. But he just kind of tugs on her and he says, "A naked American man stole my balloons." And that line is just perfect. It makes me laugh all the time. But now I'm jumping all over the place. But to focus back up, when he leaves the hospital, he goes and he moves in with his new girlfriend, Nurse Price. And it's not long after that when he has his iconic transformation. And I really want to stress to you guys just how amazing this werewolf transformation is. I know it's been analyzed to death, but it's still so good. The practical effects, the different body parts like the hands and the feet, and even the head changing before your very eyes into this canine snout. And all that is great, and it's so impressive that they were able to pull this off to the point where you see pretty much every single body part change into something closer resembling the wolf, and that's no small feat. And for me, the most impressive effect in this whole sequence is the back, how the back changes and you see the spine raise up and the shoulder blades change. But something about this sequence that I really haven't heard a lot of people touch on as they're discussing the mastery of this scene is the sound design. And if the sound design wasn't so gross, I don't think it would have worked. I think the sounds here really force you to accept that anatomy is changing, because it's this really gross creaking and stretching and groaning, and it's just so good. What can I say? They did such a good job on this sequence, and it is the highlight of the movie by far. But that's not to say the rest of the movie isn't also great. Everything in this movie is firing on all cylinders, and it just keeps going from here. We see a few different werewolf attacks that night. We see this couple, we see 3 homeless people, we see this dude in the subway, and the dude in the subway is probably my favorite one because it's the longest, and it's the one where we actually get to see the wolf, although briefly. Most of it is shot from like the wolf's POV, but there's this one shot at the top of the escalator where you actually see the wolf from a far distance. You don't really get any detail coming up just into frame, creeping before it cuts away again, but you do see it. You do see the size and scale of this wolf, and it's pretty intimidating. I guess John Landis had planned to make these different attacks a lot longer, but the censor made him cut it down because they were just too violent. And I do think the less is more approach does work for a lot of these. Like I said, the subway scene, you only see him for a brief second, and then you see this very extreme close-up of the wolf and his snarl and his really gross face, and that's all you really need to see. But for me, the one that doesn't really get its due is the one with the 3 homeless people. It's so quick and they cut away so early that you don't really see anything of the attack. You only see these 3 guys sitting out, in the middle of the night, and they see the wolf, they have a bit of a reaction to it, and then you see the close-up of the wolf and it cuts away so fast, blink and you miss it. Well, I don't need to see blood and guts spewing everywhere, just a little bit more tension and horror in that sequence for us to really feel bad for these homeless people, because you do ultimately feel bad for pretty much everybody else, especially when you see them later on in the adult theater when Jack reveals them to him and is like, look, this is what you've done. You've killed all these people and they won't find peace, just like I won't find peace until you die. So please just kill yourself before the next full moon. What I'm talking about, Jack's makeup effects actually go through a transformation of their own. The first time you see him, like I talked about, he's very fresh and visceral and it looks like he just died that day. But then the next time you see him, just before the big transformation scene, and here he looks a bit more decomposed, a bit rotted. He's very green and just monochromatic, and it's a very stark contrast from the last time you saw him. So immediately you're like, okay, what changed? Because he didn't look like that before. And then the third time you see him, which is in the theater, and it's when he brings all the other fresher victims, he looks like a zombie, mostly just a skull with some bits of flesh still hanging on. And I guess this technically isn't even a makeup effect, it's a puppet that they actually had the actor Griffin Dunn articulate so that it would sync up with his lips. So he did perform that puppet, which is pretty cool. And this progression every time we see Jack is probably just as memorable and original as the main werewolf transformation. It's just such a fresh idea, and I'm so glad that this movie did that, because it has something tangible that separates it from other werewolf movies. Even though in execution, this werewolf movie is clearly heads and tails above pretty much every other movie. I don't know, if you have a werewolf movie that you like better than American Werewolf in London or think is better made, let me know. I'd love to watch it. I've seen a few and I have been impressed with some, but for me nothing else really hits the same way American Werewolf does for me. There's just something so original about it, and I think Jack does play a big role in that, because where else do you see a werewolf and a zombie being best friends? But I better wrap this up pretty quick, because when he's in the theater he does wolf out again, and it's admittedly not as impressive as the first time, but really nothing's going to beat that first time. But there are still some pretty unique differences. When he's clutching the back of the seat in front of him, you see the claws come out of his fingernails, and it's pretty gruesome, and that's something that we didn't really get to see in the earlier scene. And again, you see the face change and it's impressive and gross, and the sound design's all still there. And then he comes out and it becomes this really chaotic rampage through Piccadilly Circus, and it's impressive just how much carnage this wolf caused. And the wolf doesn't even really kill that many people. I think he bites a few people. He bites one person's head clean off and it goes flying over a few cars. It's pretty awesome, actually. But really a lot of the damage is done by cars just panicking and bumping into each other, and this wolf is just kind of scampering around. And again, you don't see a lot of the wolf in its final form. They use a really creative technique of having a puppeteer, I think it was Rick Baker, but it could have been somebody else, walking on his hands, basically doing the wheelbarrow, and the hind legs are puppeteered by a guy behind him. And that effect looks awesome, even though you are limited with the different angles that you can shoot this thing. They use it very sparingly, and you get enough to really understand the scale of the wolf and what the wolf's doing. But at the same time, it doesn't linger on it too much where it starts looking fake, because with the very extreme expression that he sculpted into this wolf, it could look kind of goofy and kind of artificial if you rest on it for too long. But thankfully they don't, and the wolf gets backed into this alley where Nurse Price finally comes up and tries to talk him down. She finally says, "I love you," and just the moment when you start to see the wolf's expression kind of relax and you think he's going to change back and he won't try to kill her, he goes for her. He lunges at her, and then the cops shoot him dead. He's turned back into David in an instant, and roll credits. And that's An American Werewolf in London. It ends very abruptly. It doesn't really give you a lot of time to process what just happened. You just had a very emotional scene between a nurse and a werewolf, and now it's just over. And what I love about this movie is you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as a very tragic romance that was doomed to fail because nurses and patients shouldn't really be getting together in the first place, but now you throw werewolfism in the mix and it just makes it even more tragic because you know that's not going to end well. Or you could look at it as a send-up, as a satire of werewolf movies, which I think is closer to John Landis's original vision. If you look at his other body of work like Schlock, that's clearly a send-up to really cheesy monster movies. So you can tell that that's something that's really near and dear to his heart. But the magic of this movie is that no matter which way you choose to look at it, it's still very effective, delivers on the scares, the drama, the tragedy, and the comedy, which is probably the most important part in this movie. You're not supposed to take it too seriously, but if you want to really get invested, there's enough there for it. It's not just laughs all the time. And I'm never sure where to fit this in, so I always kind of end up putting it towards the end because the soundtrack of this movie is so amazing. I really wanted to give it special notice because even though there's not a lot of original music, they use a lot of needle drops and pop music, and they all have something to do with the moon. And my favorite is the Creedence Clearwater Revival song, Bad Moon Rising. I can never disassociate that song with a werewolf transformation. It's amazing. But they also managed to get at least 3 different covers of Blue Moon, and that's just a great song in general, but now having it tied to the moon and to the werewolf lore, it just fits perfectly. And that's just awesome. Every song in this soundtrack has something to do with the moon on a thematic level, and it just helps to remind you what's at stake, what's going on, what are the rules. And having these bouncy pop songs paired with this very horrific scene you're about to experience just makes for the perfect blend of horror and comedy. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about American Werewolf in London? Is it your favorite werewolf movie? It's definitely my favorite if you can't tell. I put it on every Halloween. I love this movie so much. And if you haven't seen it yet, I hope this review has enticed you to go watch it because what are you waiting for? This is the cream of the crop of werewolf stories. But whatever you think, let me know in the comments, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby, this is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.